Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to review this new handheld. It is called the PowKiddy X28. Now this is the latest in the high-end line of devices from PowKiddy. They usually focus on the cheaper stuff. And the X28 is a continuation of a previous model they had already created called the X18S. I've done a couple videos about these, but essentially these are clamshell devices with the same chipset as like the Retroid Pocket Flip, but has a lot of other issues. For example, the controls on this are not very good, the ergonomics are not very comfortable, and it uses this really smudgy plastic. But I have to give credit to PowKiddy because this is the first device that came out with the T618 chipset. That's the same thing you will find in the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, Retroid Pocket Flip, and then a couple Anbernic devices, the RG505 and then the RG405M. And honestly, when I first bought this device, I wasn't super excited about it because I figured that, there's 5 other devices with the same chipset, we know what the performance is going to be like, and so what can they really bring to the table? But it turns out there are quite a few things that the X28 does really well, and in some cases better than the other devices that we have available. And so I think this will be a pretty interesting review. In a nutshell, if you already have one of these other devices with the same chipset, it's probably not going to be worth the upgrade. However, if you haven't bought one yet, and you're looking to get the cheapest one available, it's going to be this one here. It's $150 with free shipping. And at that price point, if you don't already have one of the other ones, I do think it's worth your consideration. And so we're going to get into all that stuff in this deep dive review right here, and without any further delay, let's go ahead and jump in. Okay, as always, we'll start with the specs. And like I mentioned, the chipset within here is well known. It is the Unisoc T618. And this model comes with 4GB of RAM and 64GB of internal storage with a microSD card slot for more. The display on the X28 has the exact same specs as the X18S. So it's 5.5 inches with a 720p resolution. And we do have a large battery inside of here. It's 5,000 milliamp hours, and I got an average of about 5 hours of gameplay in my week of testing. In terms of connectivity, we have 5 GHz Wi-Fi as well as Bluetooth 5.0. And the X28 runs Android 11 with a built-in keymapper software. Other features include a mini HDMI port, a rumble motor, and gyroscopic controls. And then finally up top we have 2 different USB-C ports as well as a headphone jack. Now let's get to the unboxing, and I should mention here this is not a review unit, so I paid for it with my own money. And this purchase was made with help from my Patreon backers, so thank you very much for that support. Moving on, inside the box you will find a USB-C charging cable, and then a quick start guide which will show you some of the specs and then the key mapping software. But of course I'm going to walk you through all of that too, so let's go ahead and get to the device itself. Now the first thing that really struck me about the X28 was the feel of the plastic. PowKiddy as a company has a really bad habit of using some of the worst feeling plastics in any other handheld, but surprisingly they really upgraded the feel here on the X28. The plastic itself has a little bit of a gritty texture that feels nice and grippy and also doesn't pick up on fingerprints. If anything, I hope that PowKiddy continues to use the same texture in future devices. While we're here, let's take a look at the back, and you can see it has this grid type design to it, and I think it's meant to convey the fact that it's ventilating air, but there are no holes right here. Moving over to the front here, one of my first misgivings about the X28 was this more angular design. But as I'll show you in the ergonomics section, it actually is more comfortable than I thought it would be. Other things that caught my eye are the front-facing speakers, and the fact that this device has proper Android function buttons. But before we get into those, let's get into the controls. First, we have the start and select buttons on the top near the screen, and these have a somewhat clicky micro-switch connection. In fact, they're very similar to what you would find on a Nintendo Switch. Now, moving over to the D-pad, a couple first impressions. Number one, this is a glossy D-pad. You don't see that very often. And I feel like the D-pad itself is relatively thin. Now, when pressing down on the D-pad, it actually has a pretty good feel to it. This is a rubber membrane connection, so a classic retro feel. The only thing that really throws me off about it is the glossiness. It makes it a little bit grippy on my thumb more than I would expect. And so it does make it a little bit awkward to slide from one direction to the next. Now, when actually using the D-pad within software, I did start to see some problems. And the main issue here is that it is way too easy to make a diagonal. In fact, pressing a cardinal point like up and down is pretty hard to do without also doing left and right at the same time. So before we move on, let's go ahead and test that right now. First things first, when it comes to fighting games, it's actually pretty good to have easy diagonals. For example, with a Street Fighter game, it is very easy to do both dragon punches and fireballs. So I would say that this D-pad is definitely Hadoukenable and Shoryukenable. However, when it comes to games where a precise input is most important, then things start to fall apart. For example, this one completely fails the Contra test where I try to press down and then rock back and forth without moving the character. As you can see, just a hint of left or right while you're pressing down will move the character, and so this is going to result in you probably dying when you're trying to play a game like this. Here's another example. In Super Mario World, I play this level all the time, and I always try to throw the Koopa shell straight up. But as you can see right here, I had a very hard time aiming up in order to throw the shell. And this is something that I would typically not find in other retro handhelds, so this is a little bit worrying to me, especially if you're concerned about very precise inputs. And finally, another example here is Celeste. Now this is one where it's important to go up and down and then to the diagonals when you want to. And I found that many times when trying to go just straight left or right or up and down, I would do a diagonal instead. And in a game like this, that tiny little difference is going to be a matter of life or death. And so unfortunately, I don't really like the D-pad inputs on the X28. I think the diagonals are just way too sensitive. Okay, moving forward, let's test out the analog sticks next. Now these are Nintendo Switch style analogs, and these have been a feature in many handhelds over the past few years. In terms of just overall feel, they feel good, they have a good range of motion. However, again, when we go into the software, then things start to look a little bit worse. For example, with this one, it has a lot of cardinal snapping, so a lot of up, down, left, right motion. And on top of that, these sticks are going to snap all the way to the edge when you press down on them. And so unfortunately, they do not have a lot of nuance to these analog sticks. Instead, these behave more like an 8-way switch, like an old style arcade. Now it is possible with these sticks to get a little bit more nuanced control, but it takes a lot of effort. For example, if we try to play a PlayStation 2 game like Final Fantasy XII, this is a game where if you press the stick halfway, your character is supposed to walk. And then if you want to run, you would push it all the way. Unfortunately, the way these sticks have been calibrated, as soon as you start pressing on the stick, your character is just going to immediately start running. Again, it is possible to make your character walk, but you have to just barely press the stick, and it is very difficult to do. And so when it comes down to it, if you try to play a game that has more nuanced analog controls like a modern game, you're not going to have as tight of a control scheme as you would probably like. And this is going to come into effect when you try to play modern day games, especially over game streaming. For example, when trying to play a first-person shooter like Halo Reach, the experience feels pretty terrible. Instead of being able to move around the way I would like, it just feels like a very jerky experience. Now unfortunately, to add on top of that, the key coding they have here within Android is not correct. So when you try to do game streaming like on Xbox Game Pass like this, or maybe PlayStation Remote Play, you will find that the L2 and R2 buttons are not mapped at all. And this is a very common thing with a lot of cheaper handhelds. We see this on a lot of PowKiddy and Anbernic devices. And because a lot of streaming games do rely on L2 and R2 buttons, this makes most of these games unplayable. Now you would hope that there would be software updates in the future to be able to fix this control scheme. However, unfortunately within the PowKiddy software, there is no means to do any sort of over-the-air update. And so it looks like unless somebody builds a community Android image that we can use instead of the PowKiddy one, you're not really going to be able to use this device for game streaming. So unfortunately, much like with the D-pad, I'm pretty disappointed in the actual use of these analog sticks. Okay, sticking to the left side here, we have our quick look or menu button here on the left, and then the key mapper button on the right, and these also have a clickiness to them, much like the start and select buttons. On the right side, we have our start button, and now let's take a look at the 4 face buttons here. And honestly, among all of the controls that are on this device, these are probably the best. These are also glossy and have a rubber membrane connection, so have a nice classic feel to them. In fact, if anything, they remind me a little bit of smaller Steam Deck buttons with a little bit less roundedness to them. But either way, I have no complaints about these face buttons here. In fact, I think that PowKiddy really nailed them. These are the kind of buttons I would like to see on most retro handhelds coming out today. And finally, finishing out the right side, we have another analog stick, and then our back and home key buttons here on the bottom. And then of course we have our stereo speakers here on the bottom, which we'll test here in a moment. Before that, let's go ahead and check out these shoulder and trigger buttons. Now these are also glossy, but have a very clicky feel to them. And they are easy to press down on, but they're a little bit louder than I would like. Either way, when it comes to these shoulder buttons in particular, I think they're just wide enough to be comfortable, while also still not taking up a bunch of space. And it's a similar story with the trigger buttons. These actually feel pretty comfortable to press down on. But also bear in mind these are a digital input, so just on or off. However, in the end, I like the fact that they have stacked shoulders and trigger buttons, and they are not hard to press down on. I think they're actually pretty good buttons, just a little bit loud. Okay, now let's look at the I/O on top. I should note there is nothing to see on the bottom. To start, we have our power button and then the micro SD card port, and then we have our USB-C charging port and a charging indicator LED. Next, we have a mini HDMI port and then the OTG port if you want to plug up any peripheral. I should also note that you can charge from the OTG port as well. And then finally on the right, we have our headphone jack and volume buttons. And it should be noted that the volume up is on the left side and not on the right. Okay, and so now let's move over to the actual comfort and ergonomics. And surprisingly, for its size, this is a comfortable handheld to hold. All the buttons are easily within reach, and it doesn't feel like a stretch even when using the analog sticks and the triggers at the same time. And like I mentioned, even though it does have an angular design to it, there's enough roundedness to it that it doesn't bother me at all. Now, much of the ergonomics are thanks to the rounded grips that we have here on the back. These are slightly pronounced, not super huge, but all the same, they do kind of mold into your hand pretty easily. Now, because this device isn't huge, you're not going to be able to grip it with your whole hand. It's really just going to be your index and middle fingers that will be supported by this grip. And so really your ring finger and pinkies are mostly just going to support the bottom edge of the controller. So I would say it's not the most ergonomic thing in the world, like I would not want to play this for hours on end, but I found that playing for an hour or two is perfectly comfortable. So I think when it comes down to it, the X28 is a comfortable handheld given the size that we have overall. Okay, now let's take a look at the screen and also do some size comparisons against other devices. And as you can see, this is an OCA laminated panel and it does have slightly large bezels, but not too big. Let's do some comparisons against other devices, starting with the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus. Now this device has a 4.8-inch screen, so it's a little bit smaller, but same 16:9 aspect ratio. And as you can see, the 3 Plus is quite a bit smaller. But I was also surprised to see just how vibrant the colors were on the X28, especially compared to the 3 Plus, which is a very saturated panel as well. And the 3 Plus here is at the default saturation level, but all the same, you can see that the X28 blues are just much deeper than on this one. Another favorite of mine is the Anbernic RG405M. This one has a 4-inch screen but with a 4:3 aspect ratio, and as you can imagine this is a much more pocketable device compared to the X28. But of course there are going to be some concessions. For example, it has a 480p resolution panel. And so honestly I don't think these are a good comparison between the two other than the fact that they use the same chipset and so they'll be able to play the same type of games. Another device with the same chipset is going to be the Anbernic RG505. Now this one uses a 5-inch OLED panel, but even then you can see that the colors are still more vibrant on the X28. Now admittedly the Anbernic has much deeper blacks which makes everything more pronounced, but all the same I was still very surprised to see the X28 holding its own against an OLED panel. Next up, we have the Retroid Pocket Flip. This one has the same screen as the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus. And similarly, as you can see, this one also is not quite as saturated as the X28. Now, in terms of sizing, this one's pretty big when you have it opened up, but when you close it up, it makes it much smaller than the X28. And then finally, we have the X18S. Now, this one has the same size screen and same resolution. And given the fact that it's from the same manufacturer, it may be that these are the exact same panel. But even then, in a head-to-head comparison like this, it does look like the X28 is a little bit more saturated. And like I mentioned in the intro, the X18S is a clamshell, so when you close it up it is going to be smaller than the X28. And also here's a good look at the smudginess of this plastic. See how bad it is right here? After a week of heavy use with the X28 on top, this one doesn't have any smudges at all. So again, I want to reiterate how good this new plastic feels compared to their older models. Okay, now let's do a weight comparison. So it is 296 grams for the X28, and that's about on par with other handhelds of this similar size. It is quite a bit heavier than the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, but this one is also smaller and thinner. And of course, same thing with the RG405M. This one's much smaller, but made with a metal shell. The Retroid Pocket Flip is a little bit lighter, but this is also a relatively heavy handheld for its size. A better comparison is going to be something like the Anbernic RG505. This one's smaller than the X28, but about the same weight altogether. And then finally, the X18S is a little bit heavier than the X28. But again, this makes sense because clamshells have a lot of plastic to them. Now, in terms of portability and pocketability, I would say this is a portable but not pocketable handheld. Now, if you're wearing shorts like me and you have larger pockets, then yes, you can fit them in a pocket. But all the same, this is not a device I would like to walk around with in my pocket. So if anything, I would say this is the kind of device you would probably use when you're around the house, and if you are going to take it out, you're probably going to want to put it in a case. Now luckily, it's almost the exact same size as the Nintendo Switch Lite. These two devices have the same size screen and the same resolution as well. And if you stack the devices on top of each other, yeah, they feel almost exactly the same, other than the fact that the Switch Lite is thinner. And of course that makes sense, because the Switch Lite doesn't have these nice hefty grips to them. And so if you've tried a Nintendo Switch Lite and you like the size and the heft of it, it's almost exactly the same with the X28. And luckily, most Switch Lite cases are going to work perfectly as well. Okay, next we're going to talk a little bit more about the screen. So usually when I was testing it, I would play everything at about 50% brightness. That seemed to be the best balance for me. Now, if you bump it up all the way to 100% brightness, it does get quite bright. It's not the brightest panel I've seen, but I think it's going to be a good fit if you're playing in a well-lit environment. And on the other hand, it does get quite dim at the lowest brightness as well. I'm not sure you'd want to play it in complete darkness, but all the same, I think this is going to be good in a low light environment as well. In the end, I think there's a pretty good dynamic range here between the dimness and brightness on the X28. Now, one thing I did notice, and it's really hard to pick up on camera, is that the viewing angles on this screen are not the best. Now, given the form factor, you're probably going to angle the screen directly at your face anyway, but all the same, it is tangibly worse when you are looking at it at an angle. But again, in a real world handheld context, I don't think it's really going to apply. Now, I want to do a direct comparison of the screens with my 4 favorite T618 devices. And like I showed earlier, yes, the X28 is a much more vibrant and colorful display. And in terms of color, I think it's well balanced too. By comparison, I think the RG405M has a little bit more green of a tint, and I think that both Retroid screens are a little bit warmer on the blue spectrum as well. In the end, I don't think that any of these 4 screens are necessarily bad, but in a direct comparison like this, I actually think the color balance on the X28 is probably the best. And another thing that the X28 does very well is that it's nice and saturated without losing definition. For example, with both Retroid screens, even though they're nice and saturated, the colors do get a little bit washed out. Meanwhile, on the X28, I think it's just a little bit more well-defined. In terms of resolution, I think that 720p is a good middle ground, especially when you consider which systems can be emulated on this machine at those higher resolutions. However, when it comes to playing pixel games, you will see a pixel imbalance just based on that lower resolution. And so like you can see with the Mega Man Life Bar here, it is uneven. Now, the easiest way to fix this is to try different shaders, and I recommend a couple different ones. In this example, we're going to use the Sharp Bilinear 2x Prescale shader. And you can find this one within the interpolation folder in RetroArch, and this will balance out the pixels but make it a little bit softer. But personally, I think it's a good compromise to be able to have a full screen experience while still getting balanced pixels. Okay, next up we're going to do a sound test. And we're going to test this at 100% volume so we can get a feel for whether or not the sound is going to distort, but then also we can see just how loud this is going to get overall. And I'm going to use the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus as a comparison, because I think among all the other T618 handhelds, the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus probably has the best sound. Now, a couple things here. I wasn't surprised to find that the X28 volume was louder. After all, the speakers on the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus are on the bottom and more towards the back. But the thing that did surprise me is just how clear the audio was with the front-firing speakers on the X28. And so I think among all the other T618 devices, the X28 actually has the best sound. Now, as we wrap up the hardware section, let's do a quick teardown to look inside. And the device is pretty easy to take apart. It's just 4 Phillips head screws, and then you'll want to use a plastic spudger to remove the clips between the 2 plastic shells. Now, first thing I noticed is that the battery is attached to the back, which means that yes, even though they have quote-unquote ventilation grills on the back, they're not actually ventilating anything. The other thing worth noting is that these are just using standard Nintendo Switch Joy-Cons right here. And so if you want, you can likely swap these out for Hall sensor analog sticks instead. But bear in mind that you'll probably still have those same analog stick issues within the software. Other than that, I think this is a pretty sophisticated design, at least coming from PowKiddy. For example, they have modular controller boards, which means that if one of these go out, it's going to be pretty easy to just replace that. In the end, when it comes to hardware, I like most of the X28. The 2 things I don't like are the diagonals on the D-pad and then the sensitivity of the analog sticks. But I think there's a lot to like, including onboard function buttons and front-firing speakers. Okay, that's it for hardware. Let's move over to the software side next. And like I mentioned earlier, this device is running Android 11, and I'm going to walk you through that initial experience when you first boot it up. Now, as you can see, they're using a quick launch software, and this is the same one that we saw on the X18S previously. And I get it, they're probably trying to make a very simple menu interface for people who want to treat this like a gaming device, but I've always found that a setup like this tends to be clunky and kind of gets in the way of your overall experience. But as you can see, they've preloaded it with a bunch of different apps and emulators. And so if you really wanted to, you could probably try to figure all this stuff out. But honestly, from my perspective, it's better just to get into Android. So let me show you how to do that. You're going to want to go into the settings and then all the way over into the advanced section. That's going to bring up just the standard Android options. And within there, you want to go into the apps and notifications menu. From there, tap on the advanced button, which is going to bring up the default apps option menu. And then you'll find the option to change the default home app. And that'll basically give you an Android tablet experience like this. And thankfully, this device comes with the Google Play Store installed. Now, when it comes to the actual setup of an Android tablet, I'm going to do that off camera. But luckily, I do have an Android emulation starter guide. And so if you want to know how to set up an Android device like this one, I will leave a link to my written guide and video down in the description below. And I would consider this to be maybe a weekend project, but once you're done, you'll have some pretty great results. And this is what it could look like. Now I'm using a newer theme called Pop on the Daijisho front end, and yeah, it looks really great. And essentially what you can do here is use the shoulder buttons to tab between your systems, but you can also use the trigger buttons to tab between the different sections. So for example, you could access all of your apps right here. Either way, I really like this setup because I can then choose my system and then navigate through the games list and then launch the game from there. Now, before we get into the actual gameplay, let's do a little bit of performance testing first. And here I'm just going to run the standard wildlife test. Now, I don't think that synthetic benchmarks are going to be the end-all be-all when it comes to retro gaming devices, but all the same, by comparison, you can see that some of these numbers do vary quite a bit. Surprisingly, the RG405M has the highest score of 741, and the Retroid Pocket Flip and 3 Plus are neck and neck at about 725. Meanwhile, the X28 is quite a bit worse than the three others. We're looking at 682 altogether. But of course, these benchmark numbers are going to be only one piece of the pie. For example, in a real-world scenario, the Retroid devices do perform a little bit better than the RG405M. And now that we have the numbers, let's do a game test so we can see what kind of performance we can expect from the X28. Now, when it comes to the lower-end handheld systems, things like Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance, these are all going to play absolutely fine, and they look very good on this vibrant display. And as we move into the retro home consoles, we'll have a very similar experience as well. So things like Nintendo, Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, all these 16-bit systems, yeah, they're going to play great. But bear in mind that for Nintendo and Super Nintendo in particular, you're probably going to want to put on a shader just to have the balanced pixels. Another shader I like to use is called Pixelate, and you can find this one in the same interpolation folder that we found that other one earlier. Moving on from there, when we're testing arcade systems, this also does really well. So I would expect to be able to play any of your arcade favorites from the 1980s and probably up through the mid-1990s as well. And that does include systems like Neo Geo. The entire catalog here is going to play no problem. Moving on from there, let's move over to the 3D-based systems. These are going to be great on this device because you can upscale those 3D polygons to make them even more crisp and clear. So for example, with PlayStation 1, we can use a 3x resolution, which will give us a 720p signal. And this is going to feel a little bit like playing a remastered version of an older game. It's a similar story with Nintendo 64. This one we can also do at a 720p resolution. And all the Nintendo 64 games that I tested at that 720p resolution did perfectly fine. Now, Sega Saturn's a little bit harder to emulate, so for this one I recommend using the native resolution. And for the most part, if you use the standalone Yabasan Shiro emulator, you will probably be able to run these games at a high frame rate. Now, I did find that some games had some graphical issues, for example Nights into Dreams right here. And so if you run into any graphical issues like this, I would recommend testing out the RetroArch core to see if you can get some better graphics on that one. Moving on from there, let's try out Sega Dreamcast. This is going to be at a 960p resolution or 2x upscale. And this is also a system that did really well with every single game that I tried. And the nice thing about the Dreamcast games is that many of them have widescreen support. So you can turn this on in the emulator settings to be able to get a full screen experience without having to stretch your characters. Either way, yes, I would say the X28 is going to be a very good system to play Sega Dreamcast. And another system that does really well on this device is going to be the PlayStation Portable. And this one we can also run in 720p or a 3x resolution. And I would say at least 90% of games are going to play at this resolution and work perfectly fine. However, some of those harder to play games like God of War Chains of Olympus, you will have to drop it down to a 2x resolution. However, even at a 2x resolution, these games still look very good. Up next we have the Nintendo DS. Now this one has a high resolution setting within the Drastic emulator, and if you turn that on, it'll sharpen some of your graphics, and I still found that all games played at full speed even with the setting turned on. Also bear in mind that this device does have a touchscreen, and so because of that you will be able to use DS games that require a touch input. It will be a little bit weird because you'll have to toggle between the two different screens, but all the same, if you want to play your favorite Nintendo DS games, this is not a bad way to go. Moving up from there, we have the Nintendo 3DS. Now this is one of those systems that is very hard to play on this chipset. But I'm also happy to say that the Citra team now has a Canary build available on their website that has support for the Vulkan backend. I would say this is still a work in progress here on Android. I found that many 3DS games, even with the Vulkan backend, will still have quite a bit of stuttering. But it is very nice to see that we have options between OpenGL and Vulkan in case one game runs better on the other. However, as it stands, the performance here with 3DS is about what I expected. And that means that at least half the games that you try are going to be stuttery, and so you may not actually enjoy this experience. As it stands right now, the cheapest way to play good 3DS on a handheld remains the original Nintendo 3DS. Okay, and finally, let's move over to some of those really hard to play systems on this chipset, including GameCube and PlayStation 2. And with these systems, there are many games that are going to be playable. However, it is going to require some tinkering under the hood. For example, I recommend using the PAL version of these ROMs, that way you have a max refresh rate of 50 frames per second. That's going to mean that more games are going to play at full speed. And then on top of that, you'll probably have to hop between different emulators for certain games. Some games are going to run well with the official version of Dolphin, where others are going to perform better with the MMJ versions of Dolphin. And you'll find links to all of this within that Android starter guide that I mentioned before. Either way, when it comes to performance, I would say this is on the low end spectrum of the T618 devices. And so it's not going to be as fast as like the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, it's going to be closer to the Anbernic RG405M. Either way, when it comes to PlayStation 2 and GameCube, it's going to be the same experience. You're going to want to use these PAL ROMs, and I would say about half the catalog is going to be playable at the native resolution. But if you want to mess around with these settings and different emulators, you can definitely get a higher percentage. Regardless, yes, you can play these systems on this device, but you're not going to be able to play every single game in the catalog. It's also going to be a similar story for Nintendo Switch emulation, but at a lower level. Using the Skyline emulator, you will get some titles to work, but it's going to be only the very lightweight games. Either way, it is pretty cool to play lightweight or indie Switch games directly on an Android device like this. And it's going to be a similar story with native Android games, and so these lightweight games are going to run just great, but I would not recommend trying to play something heavyweight like Genshin Impact. Now, like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, there is a keymapper software built into the Android that we have here. To bring this up, you just press the G button and you'll see a full menu like this. And the setup here is pretty easy. You just want to move over your buttons to whatever place on the screen you want them to press, and then after you press the save button, it's going to remember where they are. And so if you have a game that has on-screen controls and you want to play it with the controller, it's definitely possible here. It is a very simple setup, but all the same, it works really well. And then finally, when it comes to game streaming, like I mentioned before, the L2 and R2 buttons aren't going to work at all. And so if you're hoping to stream your favorite Xbox or PlayStation or PC games, I don't think this is going to be a very good fit. Instead, with this chipset, I would recommend one of the Retroid devices because those buttons actually work. Okay, before we start wrapping things up, let's go ahead and test the HDMI out functionality on the X28. And this is very simple. You just need a mini HDMI cord plugged into a TV or a monitor, and as soon as you plug it up, it's going to work just fine, including video and sound. And the onboard controls will continue to work as you have it plugged in, and so if you want to play it just like this, you can totally do that. And if you want to consoleize the controller, this works out pretty well too. So all you have to do here is just pair a Bluetooth controller, and then because it's Android, it's not going to work perfectly, so you have to go into like RetroArch and change out the button mapping every time you do this. However, once you do have it all set up, yes, you'll be able to use a Bluetooth controller on this device plugged into a TV. And thankfully, when using a Bluetooth controller, things like the diagonals or the analog inputs are going to be fixed. And so if you want more nuanced controls and you want to play on a TV, this is definitely going to work. Okay, with all of our testing out of the way, let's go ahead and start wrapping things up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the PowKiddy X28. As always, we're going to start with what I like. And number one here, which is kind of surprising for me, is the texture of the plastic. Like I said, it is a night and day difference. The plastic on this one is nice and textured and feels very good to play. I also appreciate the button options that we have on this device. Number one, the face buttons are excellent, and the shoulder and trigger buttons are not half bad either. I also really appreciate the fact that we have onboard buttons for all of the Android functions and our key mapping software. I also like the quality of the screen. 720p is basically the perfect resolution for a device like this, and the screen itself is nice and vibrant and has a good color balance too. I also appreciate the front-firing speakers because it gives some of the best audio that I've heard in a handheld at this price point. And thanks to the ergonomics, this is a pretty comfortable device to hold. And I think all of this coming together at a $150 price point shipped is a pretty great deal. If you've been using retro handhelds for a while like me, you know that a couple years ago, $150 would not give you anything close to this when it comes to quality or performance. But now let's talk about some of the things I don't like about the X28. Number one is going to be the false diagonals of this D-pad. I found that with many games that require precise controls, this D-pad has let me down. And same thing with the analog sensitivity within the software. I found that when it comes to arcade games, it's just fine because you're going to use those 8-way controls. But when you're trying to play something with more nuanced analog controls, like, a Dreamcast or GameCube game, you're likely going to find that the analog controls here are just too sensitive. Additionally, they have the incorrect key coding within Android. That means when you try to play certain applications like streaming apps, you're not going to be able to have L2 and R2 controls. And then finally, even though this is a good price for the performance that we're getting, I can't help but feel that the X28 itself is too little too late. The original PowKiddy X18S, which had the same chipset, came out in late 2021. And at that time, in my review, I said that I really hoped that they would make a different device with the same chip. And here we are a year and a half later, and we finally have a handheld that's very similar to that overall design. And unfortunately, in the time it's taken them to release this device, we've now seen 4 other handhelds release with the T618 chipset. And unfortunately, I don't think that the PowKiddy X28 can compete with some of those other products. For example, if you want a nice portable handheld, I think the RG405M is a great choice. And same thing with the Retroid Pocket Flip, especially if you prefer a clamshell. And when it comes to a candy bar form factor, I still think that the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus is going to be a better choice than this one. Now bear in mind that the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus is going to come out to about $180 after shipping depending on where you live. And in the end, if you are on a pretty tight budget and $150 is the max you can spend, I still think that the PowKiddy X28 is a lot of handheld for that amount of money. But just bear in mind that for an additional $30 you can get quite a bit better of an experience. So when it comes down to it, I think there is a place for the X28 within the world of retro handhelds. But I think you are going to have very specific needs for this to be a good recommendation. At the end of the day, I feel a little bit bad for PowKiddy because this is the handheld that I wanted, but it was a year and a half ago. And as you may have seen over the past couple years, the release pace for these retro handhelds is just way too fast for a year and a half to go by. Anyway, that's really about it for this video here. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Is the PowKiddy X28 a good fit for you, or is it too little too late? As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.